So, thank you everyone for coming to my talk. Today I'm going to be talking about assessing the limitations of three-factor Hebbian learning relative to deep reinforcement learning. And I'll begin with a quick introduction. So reinforcement learning is a computational framework for modeling reward-driven learning. And basically the way that it works is that it describes the interaction between an agent within its environment, which tries to maximize its expected reward over some set of episodes. For auditory discrimination tasks, which are tasks that we're interested in this project, you can imagine an environment feeding a stimulus like a sound to the auditory cortex, which then forwards that signal to the dorsal striatum and ventral striatum, which act as an actor and a critic, respectively. The actor will eventually select an action, such as spinning a wheel, for example, or pressing a button, and then the environment will respond in kind by providing a reward or a punishment, by which the critic will use to inform future actions. And the idea is that the agent will eventually get better and better at this task over time. Now, one of the key aspects of how this agent gets better is the weight update rule, or how neurons update to match the stimulus with the correct action. And so within reinforcement learning, there are several different models of this synaptic plasticity. The key question here is, how should I update to new information? And one of the most commonly used models is called three-factor Hebbian learning, where it's proposed that neurons update based on their presynaptic activity, their postsynaptic activity, and some global reward modulator like dopamine. By contrast, in deep reinforcement learning, it's proposed that neurons update based on the influence of a given neuron on an action or an outcome. So you can think of this as the derivative of some reward prediction error with respect to some weight. Now that brings me to the motivation behind this project. Three-factor Hebbian learning has been shown to be a powerful tool for modeling learning in neuroscience, but its capacity for learning has recently been brought into question by recent advancements in deep reinforcement learning, which have been shown to be able to tackle some very complex problems. We want to understand and analyze scenarios where Hebbian learning might fail to model learning on biologically and behaviorally relevant tasks relative to deep reinforcement learning agents. And in doing so, motivate the use of deep reinforcement learning to understand how the brain might overcome these problems. That brings me to the experiments. So here we model an auditory discrimination task on two orthogonal dimensions. You can think of them as position and frequency, for example. Simulated neurons are activated by a signal drawn from one of two distributions in each dimension. So you can think of a high frequency and low frequency condition and a left and right position for simplicity. Now I'm going to take you through some of our preliminary results. And in doing so, I'll talk about each experiment as I do it. Our first experiment is the baseline experiment. It's very simple. Basically, all that we're asking an agent to do is distinguish between a left signal and a right signal. And as you can see, across 20 different trials with 95% confidence intervals, you can see that deep reinforcement learning really outperforms multi-layer Hebbian learning at almost every step of training, especially for this baseline task. Now, we wanted to add a little bit more complexity. So in our second experiment, we introduced a wrinkle at time step 5000, where basically what we did was we said, we no longer care about the left and right position. Instead, we care about low and high frequencies. So you can see that dip in performance and then the recovery thereafter. Here again, we see that deep reinforcement learning outperforms multi-layer Hebbian learning on this task. In our third experiment, what we had was an associative remapping. So again, at time point 5000, what we did was we shuffled the input neurons, and we wanted to see whether or not agents could recover by reweighting their the network to attend to different aspects of the input to again rederive the correct action. And again, we see that deep reinforcement learning outperforms multi-layer Hebbian learners on this task as well. Finally, we wanted to add a little bit of realism to our experiments. So what we did was we recognized that in real experiments with monkeys and mice, for example, they typically have some time before the stimulus is actually presented. And this time before the stimulus onset requires them to actively choose to wait at each section. And so what we did was we required the models to actively choose to wait before they could be presented a stimulus and therefore reap a reward. in this case, we can see again that deep reinforcement learning outperforms multi-layer Hebbian learning by far at every step of the training process. While these results are very interesting, I don't want to leave you with the impression that it's as simple as deeper reinforcement learning always works and Hebbian learning never works as well. In fact, what we're currently looking at is, for example, different policies for action selection, where we've shown that, where we've discovered that under very specific conditions, multi-layer Hebbian learning can actually recover its performance and once again become competitive with deep reinforcement learning models. We also want to look into different models, for example. We know that recurrence has a lot of relevance to brain activity, especially for processing temporal information. And so we would like to see how that dynamic affects the relationship between Hebbian learning and deep reinforcement learning. And finally, we also want to experiment with different layer depths. So we know, for example, in visual and auditory processing, that different layers of processing, different neurons attend to different kinds of inputs. And so all of these are very interesting questions that we're still looking at right now. And so while the question that we're asking is definitely complex and nuanced in nature, I hope I've shown that deep reinforcement learning can be a useful tool to model these biologically and behaviorally relevant tasks, and could give us insight into how we learn to adapt and improve in uncertain environments. Here are some of the references that I've used during this talk, and I wanted to extend a special thanks to the members of Gold Lab, Cording Lab, and the organizers of the MindCore Summer Fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions or suggestions that the audience may have about the direction of this project. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jordan. Here's some applause from everybody in the audience who cannot applaud. All right, so we already have a few questions in the Q&A coming in. So the first one is from Nathan Tardif, and I'm going to promote you to a panelist, Nathan, so you can follow up if you want to. So Nathan is asking, is there a known neurosignal or process that could carry the derivative necessary for deep reinforcement learning?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And so I think currently there isn't any evidence so far that there is, for example, several different signals that carry exactly the derivative necessary to update each weight. But I think what we're trying to motivate a little bit more through this project isn't that, the exact mechanism by which weights update in neural activity follows gradient-based learning, but rather that, the overall process of learning can be modeled well or approximated well with things like gradient descent, which are used in deep reinforcement learning frameworks.
Thank you.
All right. So as next question is from Nicolas Perez. Which neuron and synaptic model was used for these experiments?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it might be more helpful if I share my screen again, and I actually have additional slides which go into exactly how this modeling took place. And so basically what we have here is the actor and critic broken down, but the framework used for both the deep reinforcement learning model and the Hebbian learning model are the same. So the architectures are exactly the same. The only difference is the weight update. And specifically, an actor-critic framework was used. Actor-critic frameworks are quite commonly used to model this kind of learning. But specifically within the actor and critic, each one was a 2-layer network that was feed-forward with nonlinear activations between each level. And so the nonlinear activation we used here was sigmoids. I hope that answers your question.
Is that okay, Nicholas? All right, I'm assuming so. And we have another question from Pierre Orhan. At the beginning of your talk, you stressed that one of your goals was to prove that DRL is better modeling choice than Hebbian learning. But would you have this objective in mind would this not bias your experimental designs, having this objective?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I think that it sort of touches at the sort of heart of the issue. I think one thing that it's really important to clarify is that we're not trying to prove that deep reinforcement learning is better than Hebbian learning as as a blanket statement. We're simply trying to find situations where deep reinforcement learning might be, a better model, or it might be better at modeling learning under these specific conditions. And we want to understand what kind of conditions lead to better learning. So we're not rooting for a specific model to do better in any situation. All that we're trying to understand is under what kind of realistic situations is it good to use a specific model. And indeed, there are a lot of really great reasons to use Hebbian learning. For one thing, for example, single layer Hebbian learning agents are easier to understand under many different circumstances. So you can look under the hood and sort of interpret what exactly they're processing, while deeper networks are much harder to do that for. And so, so we're not suggesting at all that Hebbian learning is somehow worse as overall than deep reinforcement learning. We're simply looking at realistic and biologically relevant situations where it might be a good idea to consider deep reinforcement learning as a model.
All right, and we have a follow-up here from Zoom Room 2, which is actually our backend support, Yang Chu. Good question. I also wonder if there's any evidence for the counter-argument. I'm assuming he's asking if there's any evidence for Hebbian learning being better than deep reinforcement learning.
Yeah, I mean, so that last slide that I showed right before the end about trying different policies, we actually found that using some very specific policies, we could recover the performance of Hebbian learning to be highly competitive with deep reinforcement learning agents. And those are actually very interesting to look into, because looking deeper and under the hood for these specific scenarios where Hebbian learning can perform just as well as deep reinforcement learning has given us a lot of insights into sort of the underlying workings of that learning rule as well. Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's absolutely a direction that we are currently continuing to look into for more learning about these models.
Wonderful. And one more question that we have in the Q&A. This is from Katrina Hacker.
Yeah.
Do these models produce different behavioral predictions that could be compared to human-animal performance to validate one over the other?
Yes, so this is something that we're currently looking into as well. So as far as the behavior of these agents in terms of actions, there really isn't that much wiggle room, because the only actions that they can select is like left, right, or high frequency, low frequency. So there isn't too much wiggle room there. One of the things that we've been looking into is, for example, analyzing the intermediate layers and looking at what kinds of weights they apply on certain values of the input. And so that's certainly one way that we can use to sort of delineate between these learning rules and see what the intermediate layers are attending to. So that's one direction of potentially evaluating the relevance of each of these learning rules to how biological learning actually takes place.
All right, great. And Catherine, if you have a follow-up, feel free to say so. I do have actually sort of like a related question myself, which is I work in humans, and in humans, people learn very fast. And right. I was seeing that, especially after the change, the learning was very slow and steady. So to me, that sort of means that, those two mechanisms probably exist, but there's probably additional third and fourth, maybe fifth mechanism that are present. Would you say that's likely the case, or do you think those two mechanisms can explain all of learning?
Yeah, so I'm sure that there are definitely so many other models out there for learning. What we decided to focus on in this specific project were these two, which are commonly proposed. I think that one of the things sort of even within the scope of these two models, it's possible that different architectures can lead to different behaviors, and different learning rates and different hyperparameters can also result in different kinds of behaviors. But what we wanted to do was sort of establish a baseline by comparing the same architecture with sort of the same learning conditions with a different learning update rule, and see how those diverge in behavior for these specific tasks.
All right, that makes perfect sense. Well, thank you so much. Here's some, again, applause from all of the audience. And let's move.